This was the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose. The great phrases of that purpose still sound in every American heart. All men are created equal. Government by consent of the governed. Give me liberty or give me death. Well, those are not just clever words, or those are not just empty theories. Those words are a promise to every citizen that he shall share in the dignity of man. This dignity cannot be found in a man's possessions. It cannot be found in his power or in his position. It really rests on his right to be treated as a man equal in opportunity to all others. It says that he shall share in freedom. Our fathers believed that if this noble view of the rights of man was to flourish, it must be rooted in democracy. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right.
Today, every adult American citizen, regardless of race, gender, religion, or socioeconomic background, has the opportunity to vote. It is our voice. However, over the course of our history, many voices struggled to be heard. Stop for a moment and think, what would it be like to not be allowed to vote because you don't own property, or you are a woman? What if you weren't able to vote because of the color of your skin or national origin? What if you had to pay money in order to vote or take a test? These ideas may sound far-fetched today, but in the very recent past, they were a reality for many people.
Let my people go.
In January of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared that slaves were forever free. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution confirmed Lincoln's promise by permanently abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment went a step further by giving citizenship to those born or naturalized on United States soil, including former slaves. Ratified in 1870, the 15th Amendment proclaimed that a citizen's right to vote would not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, the struggle had just begun. African Americans would face a perilous journey before they freely and truly enjoyed their absolute right to vote.
Right after slavery, as we went through the Reconstruction period in our society, troops were sent into the South to maintain structure and peace. The war had ended, there was a lot of devastation, but there was also a large concentration of people of African descent, former slaves, that stayed in the South, which meant that in states like Mississippi and Alabama, you had populations of African Americans at 40 percentile and higher. So very well, African Americans began voting then. They actually had the right and the protections to not only vote, but run for office. The first African Americans elected to the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives were during that period.
It was not long, however, that African Americans began to face resistance to voting.
Even though we had the 15th Amendment to the Constitution that was passed shortly after the Civil War ended, we also had a problem with those rights being fully utilized, fully implemented in our society because of programs like gerrymandering and double annexations and grandfather clauses and poll taxes were all strategies and tactics to prevent African Americans and others that local law enforcement, local governments did not want to participate in the electoral process to prevent them from participating in that process.
My father, one of his uncles, a cousin, and a friend went to his hometown in Issaquah County, Mississippi, and declared that they were going to vote. He was driven away from the polls at gunpoint by the local sheriff and the deputies.
Supreme Court cases such as Gwynn versus United States and Smith versus Albright lifted numerous restrictions that violated the 15th Amendment. But Black voters still faced obstacles and restrictions that kept them from casting their ballot.
All of the state legislatures were going about passing literacy tests. They really effectively disenfranchised blacks by putting down what was apparently facially neutral literacy test.
There were times when they'd ask you to recite the preamble to the Constitution word for word. That was the literacy test. And indeed, if the white American went in, that's fine, it's close enough. The African American came in, nope, you missed a couple words, you can't vote today.
Congress first attempted to address voting discrimination in 1957 with the Civil Rights Act. Risking arrest and violent opposition, Southern blacks and their supporters, including thousands of white college students from all over the country, began to organize peaceful demonstrations and political negotiations to reverse disenfranchisement.
It was a noble, heroic thing for a whole cadre of people, both black and white, old and young, students and non.
They had to make sure that those rights, those privileges, and even those responsibilities were made available and shared equally among all Americans. So they put their lives on the line. They went into the South where they knew they'd be confronted by angry mobs, by the likes of the Ku Klux Klan, but it didn't stop them. They sat down in lunch counters, they demonstrated at election halls, they marched through town squares to help secure that right to vote, to make sure that the law indeed of the land would be realized for all.
At times, classrooms were nearly empty because so many black students were jailed due to their participation in these nonviolent protests. The nation watched as young men and women were attacked by water hoses and police dogs. And the nation mourned the death of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, who were all murdered because of their commitment to voting rights in Mississippi.
They got arrested, pulled over by the deputy sheriff, Cecil Price, at middle of the afternoon on Sunday, and were let go a little after dark on Sunday. And Price testified that he followed them, escorted them out of town to be sure they got out of town safely. And Price did follow them. As it turned out, from a federal trial that came about a year later, that Price had followed them with some other men, and they pulled them over. Price had pulled the signal on, pulled them over, and then after they got off the road, they pulled them out of the car, beat them pretty severely, shot them, and then threw them under this dam that was being constructed, and then had a caterpillar there and pushed the dirt over it to hide the bodies.
These volunteers from all different backgrounds symbolized the risks of participating in the civil rights movement in the South during what became known as Freedom Summer.
So it became necessary then to actually demonstrate, to show that these things were happening, to hold marches and demonstrations, to bring attention to the problems people were having registering to vote. When C.T. Vivian marched with a group of preachers to the election hall to say, we've got these people, we want to register and vote, and to have that sheriff standing in the doorway of the election hall saying, we're closed now, in the middle of the afternoon, y'all come back at another time.
You can turn your back now and you can keep the club in your hand, but you cannot beat down justice. And we will register to vote because as citizens of these United States, we have the right to do it.
Capturing that kind of brutality on video allowed us to show the country that indeed there were those within our society that even though they were citizens as well, paid taxes like anyone else, had the same values, tried to raise their children in the right way, wanted to see their children educated and move on, that indeed for some reason, just because of the color of their skin, they were not able to exercise our most sacred value right, and it is the right to vote.
On March 7, 1965, the country was stunned when 600 peaceful civil rights marchers were violently assaulted by Alabama state troopers, local sheriff's officers, and unofficial posse men with billy clubs and tear gas in Selma, Alabama, in one of the worst unprovoked attacks recorded in our history.
This is an unlawful assembly. Go home or go to your church. This march will not continue.
As the TV cameras rolled, we saw those police officers on horseback looking more like a militia, coming through and attacking this peaceful group of demonstrators that were simply marching to exercise not only the need for a right to vote, but their First Amendment right to make those concerns heard. I think we saw the brutality that happened to those marchers, and we saw John Lewis being beaten to the ground, as a matter of fact, during that time. We knew that something was really wrong in America, and now was the time to fix it.
In August of 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The Voting Rights Act is deemed the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. It was the first comprehensive solution to protect the rights guaranteed by the 15th Amendment and was specifically designed to combat racial discrimination in voting.
We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And with this faith, we will go out and adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. We will be able to rise from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. And this will be a great America. We will be the participants in making it so. We shall overcome.
Women play a powerful role in American politics today. Women hold positions on city councils. They are mayors and governors, Supreme Court justices, senators and representatives, secretaries of state, and have been candidates for the highest offices in the land. But it is the women in our history who had no right to vote and who held little or no official power who perhaps have had one of the biggest impacts on America. In July 1848, a 19-year-old seamstress from New York named Charlotte Woodward attended the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. That first convention marked the beginning of a 70-year struggle to secure the right to vote for women.
There were many reasons why women were not allowed to vote. Men gave their reasons that women were the weaker sex and needed to be protected, needed to be sheltered. Men gave the reason that women would be emotionally harmed if they had to make difficult decisions about whether we needed to go to war and how to deal with budgets. Women, however, had been dealing with difficult decisions all of their lives, and many women worked together and found allies to pursue the women's right to vote.
Many women were arrested for voting. In 1871, Susan B. Anthony succeeded in casting a ballot on Election Day. She was subsequently arrested, found guilty, and ordered to pay a fine of $100. To this, she replied,
"May it please your honor, I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty."
Others, like Alice Paul, organized marches and demonstrations picketing the White House. In 1913, Paul, aged 23, led 8,000 suffragettes in a peaceful march for women's suffrage on the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration day. The marchers were attacked by an angry mob. Hundreds of women were beaten and spat on, but no arrests were made. Unmoved, the suffragettes marched again on the eve of President Wilson's second inauguration in 1917, holding two banners: "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" and "How long must women wait for liberty?" Because of this, young leaders were jailed and even force-fed when they waged hunger strikes while in jail demanding their right to vote. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, women not only took jobs in factories to support the war effort, but also joined the Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. In all, over 30,000 women served as nurses, yeomen, and clerks for their country. But they still could not vote. Soon, even President Wilson could not overlook the women's movement. He began to support the idea of women's suffrage.
The struggle that we have had in this country for women and minorities to gain equity was a very necessary struggle, because this country would not know the greatness that it knows without the diversity of the races as well as the genders.
On August 26, 1920, Tennessee became the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and it became law. The language is surprisingly simple for such a long struggle. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of sex. By that time, the women who had attended the Seneca Falls Convention had all passed away, all but one, Charlotte Woodward. The teenage seamstress from New York had waited for 72 years to be able to vote. She was 91 years old when she proudly cast her first ballot. Just as women and African Americans had to confront discrimination and intolerance in their pursuit for the right to vote, so did Hispanic and other language minorities. The largest subgroup of Hispanics is Mexican Americans. For a period of over 40 years, legislation effectively barred Mexican Americans from voting or diluted their vote.
When I was born, 1944, that was the last year of the white primary here in Texas. That meant only whites could vote, and you had to affirm that you are a white person. So the white primary excluded everyone. And at that time, the courts deemed that that was a private matter of political parties, that the only thing that the federal government should intervene in is national elections.
Other barriers included the drawing of boundaries to prevent Mexican Americans from electing officials. For example, there's a term called packing, where if Hispanics have the ability to elect 2 members of city council in 2 separate districts, then the majority Anglos would redraw the lines and pack the Hispanics into 1 district, so they could only elect 1, not 2 representatives. Then there's an alternative technique called cracking, where if Hispanics are very influential in 1 district and are able to have a strong voice in who gets elected in that district, then they will redraw the boundaries and split that block of Hispanic voters and crack them so that they will not be able to influence the outcome in that district. These are some of the techniques that resulted in the gerrymandering of Latinos or Hispanics and keeping Hispanics from electing the representatives that their voting strength would indicate they could elect.
As the Mexican American population grew, their voice grew stronger, and soon the state and federal government took notice.
In the early 70s, Latino students worked together to plan how to become involved in local politics in order to improve the quality of schools. In Crystal City, Texas, Latino students joined the parents in insisting on higher quality teachers, better buildings, better books, and improved programs. When the administration did not listen to the students walked out, and the media attention to the students was national and resulted in much more participation of Latinos in the local elections.
It was just a tremendous opportunity to change the world, our world, in Crystal City, because we were in charge of our self-determination. We were making the decisions that were going to change our lives, and it did. It did.
In the late 1960s, several organizations were founded in an effort to ensure that the electoral process complied with the 1965 Voting Rights Acts. One organization in particular was the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, also known as MALDEF. MALDEF litigated several cases to end discrimination in the electoral process.
One case brought by the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund was the case called White versus Register. This was a suit involving the question whether Texas should be covered by the Voting Rights Act. Texas officials argued that the Voting Rights Act was intended to cover only southern states where testimony had been brought to Congress that proved that minorities had been denied the right to vote. Texas tried to argue that they were not part of the South and that they had no history of discrimination. But the testimony was abundant that Texas had discriminated against African Americans, Mexican Americans, and had violated the Voting Rights Act. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1973 in White versus Register that Texas shared the same shameful and tragic history of exclusion of minorities from the right to vote as the rest of the South, and ordered the state of Texas to remedy their past practices.
The final success came after Congress heard extensive testimony regarding voting discrimination suffered by language minorities, such as Mexican American, Asian, and Native American citizens. This resulted in a 1975 amendment protecting language minorities from discrimination. The amendment addressed methods used to dilute the votes of all minorities, including the permanent suspension of the use of literacy and other tests for voting. For the first time, protection of the act was extended to language minorities.
If you live in an area that has a group of people that speak some other language other than English as their first language, and if 5% or 10,000 people meet that particular language, guys, then indeed ballots have to be made available in that language as well. So it allowed even those language minorities, who are also citizens, of course, you have to be a citizen of the country to vote, to be able to cast their vote and have their will known as well through our electoral process.
With the advent of the extension of the Voting Rights Act to cover Texas, as well as language minorities in a lot of parts of the country in 1975, the number of non-white persons getting elected to office, blacks, Asians, Native American, Mexican Americans, has increased.
Thanks to the efforts and sacrifices of those who came before us, every American citizen has the right to vote. However, it was not until the ratification of the 26th Amendment that Americans under the age of 21 had a voice at the polls.
The first time I went to vote was when I was in college. Congress had amended the Constitution to allow people above the age of 18 to vote. And I was fortunate that I had just turned 18, and so I was one of those early voters. It was an exciting time in the early 70s. People were very concerned about domestic and international issues. Many of my colleagues in college were Vietnam veterans who had come back with very, very painful memories of what they had been asked to do for their country. And I was glad that these young men under the age of 21 were allowed to vote, since they had risked their lives for their country.
Get up
With every right comes responsibility. The responsibility to vote is no different. We all have a duty to our community and to those who fought so hard to educate ourselves about issues that will affect the way we live, now and in the future, as well as candidates who represent us in government.
We are, quote, the voice of the people, but if we just leave it up to the press, newspapers, and letters to the editors to express that voice, we've missed out on the big voice we have, the big megaphone, and that's the vote.
Voting is self-determination. Voting is ensuring your future the way you want.
For me personally, it's a right that my forefathers shed blood over. And when I think of the indignities that they suffered, just to be able to go into the ballot box to say, I choose this person, or I reject this person as my leader, it makes a tremendous difference.
There's a debt of gratitude I think we all owe to those that, even though they never had the opportunity to vote, believe that as Americans we should.
The right to vote is a gift given to all of us through the courageous struggles and sacrifices of others. We owe it to them to honor the gift they have given us. Educate yourself, get involved, and honor the fight. Exercise your right.
Young people still have a vision of an America as it ought to be. That this is the country that we are going to inhabit, that we're going to inherit. This is the country that very well that we want to make the vision that we have where all people are treated equally.
It's young people who were leading the civil rights movement. It's young people who were leading the women's suffrage movement. It was young people who fought for the rights for Latinos and language minorities. Young people were the ones who, in many ways, gave their lives for the right to vote. And as a young person today, I think it's absolutely important that we honor that struggle, that we honor that fight that they had by exercising our right to vote.
I think every time the polls open, they ought to be there, they ought to be registered, they ought to be voting. They ought to be encouraging other people to vote.
I can tell you that your vote, when cast, has the same power and the same influence as your parents' vote, as your teachers' vote, as your elected officials' vote. This is one of the few times in America where your voice is given the same value and respect as everyone else who casts a vote. I think that that is such a wonderful privilege. Don't waste it.